Oh, Naughty Dog, why do you tease me so? Oh, hello there. Sorry, I really need to stop setting up my camcorder to record myself reading. Which I do for some reason, but seeing as how you're here right now, we may as well get into it, shall we? And what exactly is it, you may ask? Well, so happens to be my brand new series, of course, that being Game Analyser. So in this new series of mine, I want the opportunity to talk even more about the many games the world has to offer us by digging even deeper into the layers that really craft them to be so different from one another. The standard way I plan to do is by taking two games, both connected for a certain area in game design, and then to compare and contrast both of them on various topics that hold great importance to them. Got that? We good? Because I'm not kidding, people. This video's been on the table for quite some time now, to the point that this is the fourth time that I've rewritten this intro. I really wish I was kidding. Let me clarify a few things. First of all, this is not a which game is better than which show. Even if it seems like I'm leaning slightly more positively towards one than the other, that is not the focus of the show. You are of course more than welcome to discuss in the comments as to which game you might like more than the other. Just try to be a bit civil about it, okay? Be happy, you know? Secondly, they of course have to have some form of connection between them, be they part of the same series or genre. I honestly don't think I'm going to get very far by trying to compare Pac-Man to Bioshock now. And thirdly, it's quite possible that I might end up making some changes down the line, such as making the videos a tad bit shorter. So with that all said, let's get into it, shall we? This is the first episode of Game Analyser. So what should we look at first? Well, how about two games from one of my favourite companies of all time? For today, my friends, we'll be looking at Naughty Dog's award-winning Uncharted 2 Among Thieves and The Last of Us. Let's take a look, shall we? So before we get into the real big stuff here, people, let's talk about one of the things that I think these games greatly represent, that being cinematic influence. Now, like many console generations, certain trends start to emerge, mostly thanks to our advancements in various technologies. And in the 7th console generation, the comparison between video games and films started to become even more relevant due to video game artistry managing to push past the usual blocky 3D designs of the past, as well as other technology like mocap becoming highly relevant in breaking past the uncanny valley. And really, it is thanks to our ability to improve on what we have that has allowed video games to now become a socially accepted part of our culture that has not only turned video games into a billion-dollar industry, but has also become a popular form of artistic expression across many parts of the world. That being said, there are still many today who still find it hard to consider any video game to be in the same vein as the likes of Citizen Kane or Apocalypse Now. Even very open-minded critics like the late Roger Ebert could not get behind the baggage that made video games so different from everything else. I will contest though that so much has changed throughout the last few years that we now have a much better understanding of the tools available to produce such emotional experiences for both the hardcore and casual players thanks to the diverse range of studios we have today. Despite the fact that video games started out as a basic product to provide entertainment to mostly children and young adults, we have seen a continuously growing audience for these games that manage to push the boundaries and go places beyond simply saving damsels from monsters. As it so happens, I have two excellent examples that I honestly feel are able to provide well-told stories with engaging gameplay while also managing to stand separate from one another in how they provide us with this experience. I'm going to say that if you know a decent amount of film and TV, you can kind of get a good sense as to what has likely led to the inspiration behind these games. That's not just from watching a trailer or two, because even the box art for both games is vaguely reminiscent of film posters that you'd find attached to these genres. To start off with, Uncharted is clearly designed around classic adventure movies, but adds in a bit more of the over-the-top action you're likely to come across in most of today's blockbusters. That being said, however, something that I associate greatly with the Uncharted series is its strong character relations, something I sadly don't feel like I get as much of in today's action movies. On the other side of things, The Last of Us takes a bit of a cue from dramatic and impactful stories that attempt to show us a world that has moved on without us and ask rather thought-provoking questions on subjects such as Darwinism, social collapse, and grieving over the loss of loved ones. Now, some people will say that certain story elements here, such as characters, plot points, and set pieces, can somewhat be vaguely identified in other forms of visual media, which I sort of can't deny, but in reality it's what they do with these tools to help meld story with gameplay that allows the player to experience things that really can only be found in video games. Like many stories of the past, we tend to build upon what has been conceived of before, and take note of various aspects on such things as emotion, style, themes, and other creative routes that can be used to help better our own work. You know, someone should rewrite a book about these trends. You could give it like an epic name, like The Protagonist of Many Heads, or I don't know, something along those lines. So besides these first impressions we get from these games, is there really anything else from cinema that is used to better them in my opinion? Well, the answer seems to be a big yes, with one factor being story structure. Now, due to the huge emphasis on storytelling in these games, the narrative flow for both games plays a huge part in the overall experience. After playing both of them, I found Uncharted 2's narrative reasonably easy to piece together, while The Last of Us on the other hand kinda took me a while to think of. My best guess as to why this is probably because Uncharted feels more adjusted to a 3-act structure, while The Last of Us feels more in the realm of a 4-act structure, mostly due to the seasonal time jumps used throughout the game. Similar to the likes of A New Hope or Fellowship of the Ring, Uncharted 2 follows an easy flowing narrative that manages to hit many of the right notes by having such things as a strong opening, a midway confrontation, and then of course a much built up climax to finish things off with. The Last of Us on the other hand feels very different, mostly due to the fact the intensity feels like it's constantly switching between high points when enemies are engaging you, and low points where you're freely able to explore and have conversations between characters. Uncharted approaches these heights of intensity in a very natural flowing manner, much in the same way you would towards a boss fight in say Super Mario Bros. Or Mega Man. With The Last of Us, the tense moments hit often and they hit fast, which in its own right makes sense. You are made to feel like you can be forced into a conflict at any moment in this world. I also found it amusing that while Uncharted would mark out its story with chapters titling the scenario we're walking into, The Last of Us would instead use the 4 seasons to remind us just how life-consuming this journey is for our characters. It almost feels like Uncharted uses these to have us think about what's next, while The Last of Us has us thinking more about what we've just gone through. Which speaks in more volumes when I think about my initial feelings after both games concluded, with Uncharted ending on such a positive vibe with me eager to play it again soon, while The Last of Us left me pretty drained from just about everything I'd gone through, and made me feel like I should wait a while before I even think about replaying it. So as it seems, there are some lessons to take from film that can be used to help better engage the player with the game's world and characters, but of course, some of the best films manage to come with their own variety of themes and messages for the viewer to interpret. Do these games have any? So let me just state the obvious first. Video games really don't have to come with the same level of deconstruction that you might find with, say, classic literature. Video games were built on the foundation to entertain people, and that has remained its goal for over 40 years now. That being said, as I mentioned before, the times they be changing, and to some degree I believe we can find a good amount of themes and morals in many of today's games, so long as we are willing to be open to what the developer has to say. Games like Shadow of the Colossus, Spec Ops The Line, Bioshock, and Papers, Please do a good job at making us question the roles that we are put in. So how does Uncharted and The Last of Us make do? Well, when it comes down to it, I will say that Uncharted does feel a bit more on the simpler side of things in comparison to The Last of Us, but I do find that there is a lot that can be taken from the series as a whole. For instance, the series often questions as to how much the world's greatest treasure is valued against the lives of you and your friends. This question does seem to be more prevalent in the 3rd installment of the series, but we do get bits of it here and there in Among Thieves. The image at the beginning with Drake clutching the dagger key in his bloody hands surrounded by the destruction of the train carts tells you quite a bit about how competitive and deadly this treasure hunt has become. But one other idea that again was made a bit more clear in Drake's deception is the question as to whether it really is just the thrill of the hunt that has Drake risking his life all the time.
Come on, admit it. You love all this as much as I do.
No. No, not anymore.
This is fairly interesting because it underlines with another popular adventurer who never really seemed like he was doing it for fame and fortune. That being said, Drake does seem to have very relatable motivations like family honour and keeping the world safe from falling into any more chaos. Another thought that does come to mind, which honestly could be tethered to just about every video game, is overcoming life's obstacles. Throughout the game, we're shown a goal which we have to journey to, mostly high up, and we're faced with reaching this location head on. In fact, as is mentioned in the game, the Purba's purpose was in fact to actually aid in overcoming demonic obstacles.
No, it's a Purba. It's a ritual object from Tibet. It's used to destroy obstacles.
Huh?
You know, spiritual ones.
Despite it mostly focusing on providing the player with a realistic action-adventure game they probably always wanted, this game does manage to come with its fair share of decent lessons, even if some of them became a bit more clear later down in the series. But now let's switch the spotlight over to The Last of Us to dig into the buffet that it has to offer us. We see at the beginning of the game that despite being a single parent and having work issues, our protagonist Joel still manages to find comfort in his life thanks to his loving daughter. But when he's left in this world without her anymore, he, like many others who manage to survive, become nothing more than empty shells of themselves, with the only instinct left for them being to survive.
This is how you gonna repay me, huh?
Repay you?
For all those goddamn years I took care of us.
Took care.
That's what you call it? I got nothing but nightmares from those years.
You survived because of me!
This lends credence as to why it becomes so easy for people in this world to turn on the weak and do things that many would call inhuman. Even Joel, our protagonist, admits himself that he also walked down the same dark path in the 20 years since his daughter's death. It almost seems like having all that you care about taken from you may as well be the same as being bitten by an infected. Soon enough, you just become an animal with no instinct but to prey on those weaker than you. And of course, a lot of this does end up connecting to how events transpire towards the game's conclusion, with Joel having to choose between saving the only good thing he has left in this world or let her die in the hopes that she may potentially help save mankind. In the end, despite his need to distance himself from her, he can't let the world take her away just like it did with Sarah. There's been much debate amongst people as to how they feel about its ending, whether the odds of the cure being made would have at all been possible, whether this was an outright selfish act Joel made, or whether Joel himself is in fact the villain of this story. Another thing I want to dwell on is the use of the environment as a way of spreading multiple themes and messages. The post-apocalyptic world shows us a devastating impact from a sudden outbreak that not only has the country's population decreased exponentially, but also the lack of social order has left what remains of the government to take precautions that have left many to reject their aid and form their own individual societies, leading to much brutality from both sides. On a small note, did anyone notice that no one's last name is mentioned in this whole game? Possibly because there just is no use for them anymore, as they have almost no meaning after everything that has happened to them. Another theme that you're reminded of quite often is that the world can be seen as not really dying, but instead simply healing itself. Some of you may have heard that the inspiration for the infected in The Last of Us came from the BBC documentary Planet Earth, which showed insects infected by a cordyceps fungi, explaining it would often come about when an insect species become too overpopulated and that each one matched a specific species, helping to keep a steady balance for other species to live. Obviously you can no doubt tell there's a commentary on our current overpopulation in the last few decades, but the way The Last of Us shows us just how nature has already taken root within the last 20 years gives us food for thought on just what can happen when you simply take away a huge portion of humanity and let nature take its course. Director George A. Romero, known for some of the first zombie movies brought to cinema, once stated that surprisingly he doesn't see zombies as villains but rather just a part of the planet adapting to things. So yeah, you could probably say there's quite a few things you can kind of dig out of these games. Although I will say Uncharted 2's may not be as impactful as the ones found in The Last of Us, there are still quite a few to be found, and honestly the dark themes used in The Last of Us being applied to something as light-hearted as Uncharted can't be an easy task to accomplish. That being said, it may not be impossible, as it seems that Naughty Dog has been aiming to achieve the same amount of depth found in The Last of Us to help push Drake's apparent last adventure in Uncharted 4 this year to become the perfect outing for our hero and friends. So, with any luck we may have more answers soon. Moving on now, let's get into the real meat of any game, that being of course the gameplay. In some way I kind of do have to admit that Drake can very much be seen as a male power fantasy. Maybe not on the scale of say Dante or Kratos, but like I said, it's pretty clear what has influenced these games and Nate really is no exception. But just like good old Dr. Jones and Officer McClane, Nate is very much in that middle ground of being a bulletproof juggernaut and an everyday citizen. As mentioned before, one of the themes you could interpret out of Uncharted is overcoming life's obstacles, and like many games you get a real sense of accomplishment out of seeing just how far you've actually come. The game also, in my opinion, knows how to scratch that satisfaction part of our brain. Of course, in most action movies, there's a real thrill that comes from seeing bad guys get taken down in creative ways. Uncharted simulates this by neatly closing in on you when you're performing moves like stealth kills, pulling or pushing enemies off ledges, and of course, when hand-to-hand combat is needed. I suppose I should talk a bit about the puzzles used in the game as well, even though out of the 3 games in the franchise so far, Among Thieves seems to focus the least on them. But again, a good story needs moments where you can reflect on what has happened and possibly take time to learn more about the characters and the world that the game is set in. And that is kind of what we get here, with puzzles containing historical details on Buddhist culture, along with Drake's journal giving some insight into such things as his relationship with his friends and enemies, and that despite his adventurous attitude, he does actually have a love for history. Though one does wonder when he has the time to do these notes. One thing that I've loved about the series is the way it manages to use platforming as a layer of strategy in most fights, by allowing you to move freely around the battlefield as a way of gaining better vantage points on your enemies, which does very much show Drake as being a bit more of a free thinker in comparison to other playable characters in shooters. So I think I managed to cross off as much as I could considering the size of the game, but now let's switch over to The Last of Us. Rather than portraying Joel as a rough, highly experienced survivor, they instead opted to make him feel more realistic than Drake by making death something that could happen rather quickly and rather often. In truth, you really are meant to feel weak when you come face to face with enemies. You quickly learn that lining up a shot at a guy's head and then letting the rest zone in on you is a good way to end up dead fast, especially when it's infected you have to deal with. While stealth in Uncharted may have only been used as a way to shorten out as few enemies as possible before the inevitable inevitable shootout begins, here it becomes a core part of the gameplay, allowing you to not only evade enemy detection, but also to avoid wasting as much ammo and crafting equipment as possible. But even then, when confrontation becomes inevitable, you will often have no choice but to use up supplies if you have any hope of holding your ground. Which, considering the world this game is set in, makes perfect sense. This isn't a world where surviving is a matter of pushing past everyone. It's a world where if you don't make every bullet count and learn how to sacrifice things, you just aren't going to last long. The shifts you craft are evident of this. Obviously you can keep some by you to take out enemies quickly and quietly, and also do become somewhat mandatory for clickers, but they also play a big part in gathering more supplies by unlocking extra rooms. It's here we can choose to use your shifts in the hope of finding a decent amount of supplies in the next room, or simply save them up when things inevitably go to hell. Another thing I noticed in this game is the real horror and tension that comes with many of your encounters, and I don't mean in the way you might think. The clickers are scary, sure, but it's those moments where you are low on ammo and health that really make you feel trapped and overwhelmed. There is so much used to really immerse the player in this world of depravity and degradation. One thing that really got me was the comparison between how Uncharted would have you stealth kill an enemy quickly and almost painlessly, while The Last of Us would have you choking enemies out for a good couple of seconds, giving you plenty of time to see them struggle for air as their life ends. This game can certainly take a lot out of you, which is why the moments where you are allowed to explore are so important. It's at these points that you're not only given the opportunity to improve your odds at surviving by finding drugs, parts and manuals hidden around, but also gives you the opportunity to think about the world that once was and what it's now become. You're also able to find out more about what was going through people's minds during when the outbreak first started to the last few minutes of their lives. One tale that I found to be most impactful is the remains of an underground settlement that you journey through, picking up notes detailing from when its founder returned to land to his willingness to share his home with others, only for it to end in great tragedy, like so many in this world. Both these games know how to take the advantages and disadvantages of our protagonists and use them intelligently to craft a truly meaningful experience through how we play them. Uncharted allows you to maybe not feel as helpless as you can be in The Last of Us, but it does give you the opportunity to feel like you can take on the world, whether it be climbing up the side of a train or taking out an army's worth of bad guys. The Last of Us, on the other hand, does very much want you to feel like you can be put in these situations when your life is at risk, and the only way you can overcome this is by thinking ahead, but also by taking chances. As I said, I believe these to be prime examples of how games can tackle so much and still manage to feel complete. They may not be as explorative as those that want you to find your own path, but they do very much provide the full experience that you're promised from the front of the box. And in the end, in my opinion, they are very much worthwhile and impactful experiences. Well then, that didn't take too much out of my life, but in all seriousness guys, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. This was by far a daunting task I set myself, and if you're watching this right now, that means you got to the very end, so thank you. Or maybe you might have skipped it, I don't know. I have no idea as to whether this video was both entertaining and informative for you all, but I kind of just knew I wanted to do something much bigger this time around. So of course, if you'd like to stay fully up to date, you can always subscribe for even more hot cost goodness, and if you'd like to go one step further, you can check me out on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks again guys, and hey, be seeing you around.